Hello and welcome to The Director Speaks, a lecture series on the history of art and culture. My name is Raphael Chacon and I'm professor of art history and criticism at the University of Montana in Missoula, Montana in the Western United States. I'm also the director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture at U of M. These short lectures are intended to share with you some of the exciting exhibitions at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture and to offer a broader context for the works of art on display and available through our virtual docent tours. At the end of my PowerPoint presentation, you'll see a screen with information on how to access these tours online. Most importantly, these lectures are meant to bring the visual arts and the rich histories closer to your life. So let's get started. The lectures we're about to undertake are titled Homage to Africa. And this is a 6-part series that accompanies the exhibition Homage to Africa, the Tony Hoyt and Molly Shepard collections. This exhibition is currently on view at the Montana Museum of Art and Culture in Missoula from February 5th to April 24th, 2021. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to share my screen and bring up the PowerPoint in 1 second. So as I mentioned, the series Homage to Africa is a 6-part series, and we'll be looking at a number of topics that are very interesting and of course offers that context for the exhibition currently on view. So the first lecture will be today's presentation, and that's on Africa's geography and history. We'll see how large Africa actually is. Secondly, we'll look at the topic of why Africa matters. That is, Africa is an important role to play as a continent in world history, and that's what we'll explore on that second lecture. The third lecture will be about the Gold Coast, or the Guinea Coast as it's called. And this is a very important part of Africa that in some ways has defined what the world thinks about when they think of African art and culture. The third is called Ile-Ife and the Benin Kingdom. And this actually is a lecture about a very important kingdom, a royal context in the sacred city of Ile-Ife in today's Nigeria. That topic continues by discussion of the contemporary culture of the Yoruba in Nigeria. And then in our final lecture, we'll look to Southern and Eastern Africa to look at artistic and cultural traditions there. So today's topic is an introduction to Africa's history broadly, but also specifically its geography and an introduction to its cultures. So the name Africa derives from an ancient Semitic term known as Afri, and it comes from somewhere in the north around the modern nation state of Tunisia. We know that there was a Berber term called Ifri, or Ifran, which means cave, and the Berbers, of course, are those nomadic peoples of the northern part of the continent, and it's possible that they're referring to cave dwellers or individuals who lived in the Atlas Mountains of North Africa. So the term is actually quite murky, but we know that by the time the Romans had conquered this continent and had created a province, they named it Africa, and hence the name for the continent today. Later, Muslims would call it Ifriqiya in Arabic, so the continuation of that term as well. Africa is an important continent. It is the second most populous continent on the planet. It has 1.2 billion people, at least in 2018, and it is in fact a growing continent. It is the most multilingual part of the world, with hundreds of languages and perhaps thousands of dialects in 4 large family units. And it has 54 modern nation states. I believe Southern Sudan is the most recent nation to form a part of that continent. And this is in fact the modern image that we have of Africa with all of its political divisions. And one important note to make here is that most of these political boundaries were drawn in the 19th century and subsequently in the 20th century and into our own times, as these boundaries are continued to be disputed and rearranged. And most of these, the boundaries that you see here are in fact colonial boundaries. They represent the divisions formed by the great imperial powers of the 19th century, mostly Western European powers, as they in fact carved up the continent amongst themselves and fought over large swaths of this vast continent. These are Landsat photographs, one of the globe on the left with featuring Africa in the center, and then another image on the right. These are composite photographs based on Landsat imagery, removing of course, all of the cloud cover from the continent. But one thing that is apparent when you see Africa, first of all, is its scale. It is in fact an enormous continent, among the largest on the planet. In fact, this wonderful image here represents which countries you could actually fit inside the continent of Africa. You see that almost the entirety of the United States would fit in a small portion of the continent, as would the country of China, one of the largest on the planet. But you could also fit India and many, many parts of Western Europe in this vast continent. It is indeed large. It is also quite diverse, particularly in its geography, and it is a large landmass, which a wide range of different kinds of climates and environments and ecosystems, as you can see here, from deserts in the north and deserts in the south, to lush tropical rainforest in the center, in the heart of the continent, and also lots of shrubland and semi-desertic areas in between, including savannas and that sort of region. So it is in fact a vast continent. It's also quite a rich continent in terms of its mineral and its resources. It has also an important history. It is, in fact, our mother continent. There is no human being on this planet that cannot claim their origins in this continent. We are all descendants of ancient Africans. We know that about 250 to 65 million years ago, that is a long, long time ago in the history of our planet, Africa was actually part of a much larger continent that geologists have named Pangaea. They've also divided that into two separate regions, a northern part called Laurasia and a southern part known as Gondwanaland. We're going to see those shortly in a couple of maps. About 7 million years ago, which is substantially closer to our own age, and yet still a long, long time ago, we know that the great apes, the Omidae clade, merged on that continent, and Homo sapiens, humans, evolved from those apes according to the vast majority of anthropologists. Humans, we know, appeared about 200,000 years ago on the African continent, and from there they dispersed across the planet. Africa has also been the home of great civilizations going back as far as 6000 BC, before the Common Era. African societies emerged particularly in the Nile Valley in the northeastern corner, and from there spread into what was then what historians and scholars have called the Fertile Crescent, spreading into the Near East, into Asia Minor, what is now modern-day Turkey, then across into Asia and the European continent as well. We also know that a very significant thing began to happen around the year around 4000 BC, and that is the emergence of the Sahara Desert. That is that the northern part, the northern third to fourth of the continent began to desertify, and the modern day Sahara Desert replaced a wonderful landscape of lakes and forests, and which was replaced by the modern desert that we know today. So here's a map that shows us what Pangaea, that huge continent, looked like. And you can see that parts of it fit quite neatly into each other. For example, South America fit into Africa's southwestern corner, as did parts of Antarctica, the Indian subcontinent, etc. It's a very, very large continent that about 225 million years ago. And this wonderful map here shows us that long history of the planet and the flora and fauna of the planet. And what I want you to notice is up at the very top of your screen how humans are actually latecomers to this great scheme. So we actually arrived in the very last minutes of this this ancient history. But we do have deep roots here, and human art, that material that we call art, also has deep roots on the African continent. And I'm just showing you evidence of some of the oldest art on the continent. This drawing on a piece of stone, a charcoal drawing of some kind of animal, a large mammal, actually comes from southern Africa, from the country of Namibia. So what we do know about African art is that it is a continent which has a very rich and very ancient material culture. There's evidence of human creativity on that continent for millennia. And what we normally think of as African art, that which we tend to see in museum collections around the world today, is but a kind of freezing of African culture in the last 500 years. That is the period of exploration and colonization on the part of Europeans and other humans from the rest of the planet who came to Africa and began exploiting its resources, trading, but also in some ways appropriating African culture and art and bringing it out of Africa. And what tends to happen in those contexts is the art that we look at, the things that were actually collected beginning about 500 years ago, actually gives us only a snapshot of Africa in that moment. Historians will tell you that Africa's history is very, very ancient and that much of its art is in fact gone simply because it was used and went back to the earth from whence it came. So what we really have is a kind of a skewed vision of African art that it's really only the materials that were collected over the last 500 years and the materials that have come out since through the process of archaeology, that is excavating. But what we do know is that African art has been changing and evolving over thousands of years, millennia on that continent. And what they show us is an immense variety of art from all over the continent, an incredible adaptation to the materials and the resources available to communities throughout that, and a changing of function depending on access to those resources and materials that were available to human communities there. The vast majority of the art that we think of as African art today is associated with village life and the societies that created it, mostly village-based societies, secret societies and religious associations, social associations, sometimes military associations within that society, and the events, particularly the masquerade, in which we see the presence of ancestors, the presence of deities, the presence of spirits of all types that reemerge and come back to the communities in the form of masks, costume, dance, music, drumming, storytelling, etc. So much of African art comes out of that context. It comes out of a village context, but it also comes out of a royal context. You have to remember that Africa is a continent of vast empires, great empires, recorded empires, and a lot of the art associated with those empires is items of prestige, royal regalia, etc. And the last point I'd like to make on this screen is the idea that Africa is a vibrant and living continent that continues to generate culture and continues to shape global culture today, mostly through its descendants that came out of Africa during a vast diaspora over the last 500 years. So we know that Africa has been a part of the consciousness of the world for a long, long time. I'm showing you a map. This is known as the Catalan Atlas. It was drawn up in ancient Catalonia in the late Middle Ages, around the year 1375. And what it shows us is a very accurate map of Western Europe and the Mediterranean basin, but also a very accurate map of Africa. And what we know is that even in the Middle Ages, there was a great deal of knowledge about the history of that African continent. And one of the things that we see right off the bat is the idea that Africa was in fact densely populated and populated by, and very, very rich. The image that we have today in the modern world of Africa as a poor continent is in fact an ahistorical and anachronistic idea. Even in the late Middle Ages, Europeans knew of Africa's vast wealth and coveted that wealth and traded with great kingdoms throughout the African continent. Notice how, for example, in the middle of the Saharan desert is a vast highway, enormous highway with cities up and down, left and right, identified with great kings and monarchs, including Mansa Musa, whom you see here, who in the 14th century traveled to the ancient city of Mecca, converted to Islam, and his trip and the great wealth that he shared with the world was recorded. So Africa's great wealth and its ancient history was well known to Europeans in the Middle Ages, and that knowledge, to a certain extent, was eradicated and physically eradicated over the last 500 years as European powers began to carve up Africa, to fight over Africa, and began to punish Africa. So what I'm showing you here are photographs of the British punitive expeditions to Benin City in what is now the modern country of Nigeria. The British looted these cities and filled museums, countless museums in Western Europe, with material from their exploits in the African continent. And not just the British, the French, the Belgians, the Germans, etc. The great global powers, in fact, looted Africa, exploited the continent, and in some ways worked very hard to eradicate the notion that Africa was in fact a rich continent with a very rich and impressive history. So much of Africa's majesty was lost, even as works of art, its treasures, if you will, were brought to the West as symbols of European hegemony and imperialism on the African continent. And those works of art would eventually transform Western civilization substantially, especially European civilization. And I offer you this as an example. We wouldn't have what we call contemporary or modern art without an incredible interjection of African aesthetics, African history, African art into the conversation. In fact, it's African art that helped to catalyze what we call modernism in the Western world. This is Picasso's very famous painting of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the famous women of Avignon, the pivotal iconic image for the development of abstraction in the Western world, the sort of the granddaddy, if you will, of modern art in the West. We know that Picasso appropriated much of the imagery on that, and we'll actually look at those appropriations and how African art, like the mask that you see here on the left, how it would transform modern art in the West. We'll look at that in our second lecture. Here is also the work of Henri Matisse, the wonderful modernist painter from the early 20th century, in his portrait of Madame Matisse. But you see that that likeness of Madame Matisse is not based in representation, a lifelike image of her. It's based in an African mask known well to Henri Matisse and his counterparts in Western Europe. The context of those masks was really of less importance than its aesthetic form, which is what was appropriated by Western artists. The context, as many of these masks, thousands of these masks came out of Africa, was in fact much richer than that. It was an anthropological context, a sociological context, a cultural context. And that context meant that these masks were part of ceremony, they were part of ritual, they were part of village tradition, they were part of the passing on of heritage and culture and history and myth from one generation to the next. We don't see that in our modern day museums. What we see is, in fact, only the parts that were important to Westerners, in this case, the mask. And what we ignore is, in fact, the context, the music, the history, the storytelling, the ceremony that accompanied much of this work. And it is true that a lot of African art, much of African art, is utilitarian. If we think about the artwork not just serving a purpose, a functional purpose in the society. For example, these are, this is an Ethiopian headrest. And of course, it functioned as an object, but in addition to having its function of sustaining the head when one is taking a nap or preparing or preserving our coiffures, our headdresses, or our hairdos, it also is an aesthetic object that has millennia of history behind it. We know that these kinds of wooden objects were used by the ancient Egyptians thousands of years ago. So there's continuity of traditions in the African continent, and also the continuity of aesthetics, great aesthetics. So the abstractions that we see here may allude, in fact, to architecture. They may allude to monumental sculptural forms. We don't know precisely. But what is important is that the object is not merely functional, it is also aesthetic, it is also beautiful. And that is true of African art in general. Westerners recognized that, and as they began collecting these things in the 19th century in particular, actually they began much earlier. They began as early as the late 15th and early 16th centuries. But as the collecting heated up in the 19th century and vast amounts of African art made it to Western European capitals and beyond, people began to take an interest not just in their aesthetic form, but also in the context of these works of art. And that is, in fact, the transformation that then happened to the arts of the West, as the classical arts of traditional representational arts of the West clashed with the great tendency to abstraction that we see in the arts like the ones that you see in this photograph. Western members of the avant-garde, Western elites, educated elites, began to collect African art and began for its expressive power. So not only artists like Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso, but collectors and individuals like Alfred Stieglitz, the German-American modernist. He was a photographer as well as a collector and a gallery owner. And he promoted the arts of Africa in the non-Western world, or the world beyond the West, as examples of human creativity and human expressivity, and our capacity to abstract art, and our freedom, in fact, from representation as the only existing agenda for art of the West. So these figures that you see here in exhibitions that Stieglitz hosted in New York City early in the 20th century went a long way, not just to create appreciation for African art, but also to educate artists about the possibilities of abstraction as were evident in many, many traditions around the African continent. The sculptures that Stieglitz exhibited were part of reliquary cults. That is, they were part of African traditional village life, in which the ancestors and the deities and the spirits and protective fairies were honored and represented in sculptures like the ones that I just showed you. Those sculptures that we see in Alfred Stieglitz galleries in the early 20th century were Bieri figures from the country of Gabon, and particularly from the Fang peoples. And they actually contained the sacred bones of the ancestors, who were honored and respected and treated and celebrated, feted sometimes in ceremonies. Here's another one of these figures. Western Europeans tended to look at these things in terms of their form and less in terms of their anthropology, that is, their cultural context, the spiritual reasonings, the rationale for these figures, the understanding of the role that they played in their respective societies. And yet these objects continue to transform the life of Western Europe. And again, we'll deal with that topic more directly in our next presentation. A figure like this, for example, was a protective figure. This comes from the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this is an Nkisi figure, again, a carved wooden effigy of a human, but it's a figure that is a protective figure. So the nails and the metal pieces that you see pounded into this figure actually keep evil forces at bay for the particular community that created it. I mentioned earlier that Africa is a continent of many kingdoms. And so what I want to show you is just introduce you to this idea, because we'll see this repeatedly in our lectures, that a number of great and very impressive, very powerful societies emerged in the African continent and held power and held sway and were the centers of great trade and culture, and also generated culture and dispersed that culture to other peoples. So Africa is indeed a land of many kingdoms. Western Europeans are generally pretty familiar with the ancient Egyptians, given their proximity across the Mediterranean to Western Europe, but there were many, many other kingdoms over a long, long period of time. For example, the ancient city of Great Zimbabwe. We also tend to think of Africa as a continent of villages, and we ignore the fact that it was also a city of a continent of great cities, stone cities, impressive monumental constructions, as well as the more nomadic and more rustic villages that we tend to see in the press. And So I want to very briefly show you some examples of what royal art looks like from Africa. For example, there is a kingdom here in the West known as the ancient kingdom of Mali, which spread from the Atlantic Ocean on the west deep into sub-Saharan Africa in the modern country of Mali today. And also I want to introduce you to the Yoruba, the kingdoms that existed in the Yoruba country, that is in modern day Nigeria and neighboring Benin. So two examples of royal art from Africa. This is a piece that is currently in the Tony Hoyt collection in our exhibition. And what it shows us is, in fact, how important the concept of royalty, the concept of kingship, particularly divine kingship, has been in the African continent. This is an image of an Oba, an ancient king. The Yoruba have dynasties that last hundreds and hundreds of years, that have lasted hundreds of years. And they go back to divine kings, divine beings who founded their royal lineages. This little sculpture here, covered in beads, shows us not just the majesty of a king on horseback with his 4 attendants, his military guard, if you will, but also the wealth and the prestige of a court, the Yoruba court in the kingdom of Benin. And that sculpture reflects ancient sculptures that existed in the Benin kingdom. These are bronze plaques that date from the 16th and 17th centuries, which have a very similar theme. That is the Oba, you see him seated on a horseback. The fact that this is an equestrian figure, the king is seated on horseback, tells us of his exalted status. And the fact that he's flanked symmetrically by members of the court, by his retinue, lesser beings, if you will, who are there to, in fact, protect and to exalt the power and majesty of the divine being. The ancient kingdom of Mali, as well as the ancient kingdom of Benin in Nigeria, were centers of power, great power. They traded. And they expanded culture and in some cases literacy in their parts of the world. So the ancient kingdom of Mali grew in the 14th century. And in fact, I introduced you to a Malian king, Mansa Musa, who traveled and became a part of the Islamic faith. And this is a small ceramic sculpture in the Smithsonian Institution that shows us, in fact, how important the idea of the king on horseback was to many civilizations, particularly in Western Africa. The ancient kingdom of Mali had phenomenal cities, fabulous cities, some of which are still around today. This is the great city of Genet, with its impressive mosque structure, its religious house in the center of the city. A mosque that was begun in the 13th century and has been rebuilt over the last centuries. The cities of Genet and Timbuktu, parts of this Malian kingdom, were great centers of learning, not just where knowledge was preserved, ancient knowledge going back to the Roman Empire in some cases, to the early Christian kingdoms of Africa, but also contemporary knowledge. And all the fields of science were in fact explored in this empire. This is some evidence of another kingdom. This is the Asante kingdom, also from the Ghanaian coast, down from the area of Nigeria and its neighboring countries. And I just want to show you, in fact, how ostentatious the wealth and the power and the majesty of these kingdoms were. This is, again, the Asante kingdom. This is an image, a British image from the 18th century showing the famous yam festival of the Asante, or the Ashanti as they're known. And some photographs of their kings. This is a king shown as a young man recently enthroned on the left, and him later in life on the right. Some images of the same individual, and some of the regalia that is associated with both religious and secular regalia that is associated with the power and the majesty of the Asante king. Here are some images, more contemporary images of the court and the people gathered around their divine king. And some of the wealth and the power and the majesty of these traditions, as represented by the jewelry and the textiles that you see identified with this royal court. Pretty spectacular evidence of trade and commerce and the preservation of symbology, history, storytelling through the visual arts. And those traditions continue. And my last point in this presentation is to say that African art is not static in spite of 500 years of colonization and exploitation. These traditions continue. And I want to introduce you to this artist, Elanatsui, who is Ghanaian, although he lives and works in Nigeria. He forms a part of a very impressive group of contemporary artists who in fact acknowledge the contemporary world, but also pay homage to their lineage, their history. These are textiles, enormous contemporary textiles woven by a collective of individuals who work with Elanatsui. And these things are made out of contemporary detritus, the throwaway, the castaway stuff of modern culture. And yet they constantly allude to the bling, the jewelry, the richness, the majesty of that, and the traditional wealth of African royal art. The work of Elanatsui and his collective in Nigeria. The prestige items, the material wealth of Africa is seen all around its traditional villages even today. And again, so this is, for example, an image of an enthroned king in the Kuba court in the Democratic Republic of Congo today. And those traditions, as I mentioned earlier, have spread around the world. They have been brought to the New World, certainly through the African diaspora and the slave trade. And they continue to impact artists today. This is the work of the American artist Nick Cave. And Nick Cave has invented this thing called the sound suit, which you see here in these two modern costumes. He's a very inventive artist, but as you can see, he draws heavily on the traditions of Africa, particularly in terms of movement, dance, music, the musicality, but also the inventiveness of its arts, its costuming, the actual forms that are worn in ceremony and the pageantry of it. These are more of Nick Cave's sound suits, and you can just imagine what happens when, in fact, these forms move. So we'll end here, and we'll pick up the subject again in our next conversation when we talk more explicitly about Africa in the West. Thank you very much for taking part in this presentation, and I hope to see you soon.